Okay, so this is take 100 of me trying to record this video for you, but I just wanted to clarify some instructions about the essay. There was a lot of confusion for some people, and so I wanted to make sure that we were clear as far as what the expectations were. So the essay in and of itself, the goal is to answer the essential question. So how did World War I change the trajectory or the direction of American history? And you're going to do that by identifying 5 important changes or events that resulted from America's participation in World War I and why you think it changed history. Okay, why you think it changed the direction that America was going. So one of the things that's been the most confusing for people is what you are expected to do. And one of the things that is kind of built into this particular essay is giving you a lot of creative license, a lot of freedom as far as what is required for the structure of the essay. There are certain things that absolutely need to be in there, but the number one concern of all students is how long does it need to be? And the reality is it needs to be a minimum of 7 sentences, which is the number of requirements that there are. A thesis, 5 events, and a conclusion. However, that will be very difficult to do. You can do that if you choose. It requires a very specific skill set, but most people that I've seen have found themselves about half a page, 3/4 of a page to be able to really accomplish this. But again, the length of it is up to you. It can be 1 big paragraph, it can be 5 paragraphs, it can be whatever works for you, as long as you are meeting the requirements that I list out for you. So, one is that you make sure that you have a thesis, which is what you're going to open with. That's the very first thing you say in your essay, and we're going to talk about what that is. You're going to have evidence and analysis for 5 different events, and you're going to have a conclusion. And we're going to talk about what the specifics of that are, but we'll get there in a second. So the first thing that I want to address is the thesis. This has kind of scared people, and I don't want you to overthink it. Okay, the thesis is actually a really simple concept, but it's a nice, it's the icing on the cake that makes everything look nice and pulls it all together. So just like in science, when you are trying to make a hypothesis, you have to start with a question. The essential question is the same as that science question. And our thesis is our hypothesis. It's what we think it is. So the thesis is just the answer to the question. So, for example, read through the question. How did World War I change the trajectory of American history, and what were the 5 most important changes or events that resulted from America's participation? My broad option for the thesis answers it. It says changes and events that resulted from World War I altered the trajectory of American history. 5 events and changes in particular made the greatest impact. So I answered it. I answered it kind of vaguely, but I answered the question. That's all a thesis is. We don't want to make it overcomplicated. It's short, sweet, simply answering the question matter-of-factly. In fact, when you're writing in this type of information writing, you want to make sure that you write formally. Think about it as if you're like a really arrogant professor that believes that everything that they say is absolutely true. They have no hesitation. They don't ask questions because they know. That's how your writing should sound, as if you're stating absolute fact. So make sure that you're confident in your writing. Now, I gave you the 2 options between choosing between a broad thesis or a more specific one. It just depends on what your writing needs are, what you think will be helpful for you. If you chose to go with a more specific thesis, which is going to help you with your structure, you might want to wait to write your thesis until after you choose your 5 central events in your theme. We're going to talk about that. Okay, so I've got the thesis up at the top, at least the broad thesis, just so I have it there as a reference point. But one of the things that I think we could have done better in class is brainstorming together and kind of taking the time to put in legwork at the front to make the essay process easier. So we're going to take a second to do that now so that we all know where we're headed. So first and foremost, you've got to identify 5 important changes and events. But the thing that I want to make sure that is clear, that's going to help you put this thing together, is that all of the evidence should share a theme. They should all cause similar types of change. So if you have African Americans in World War I and you have influenza, you're going to have to be able to explain why those two things cause the same type of change in the United States. So even though you think the influenza pandemic may be the most important, if you have 5 points of evidence that talk about social change, you might want to go with social change. But if you're talking about trauma, you're talking about battle deaths, and you're talking about Americans coming home and not having jobs, you're talking about PTSD, then influenza would fit in there really well. So it's a matter of just keeping consistent themes with your evidence, because that's going to make it a whole lot easier. So the example evidence that I chose is African Americans World War I. I chose to just kind of take the whole video and I'm going to summarize it as my evidence. So what I'm going to do now, assuming we're going to pretend that all 5 of my bubbles have evidence in them. Okay, it's our points of change, I mean. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide evidence that supports not only my theme, which is going to be social change, because I've got women in World War I, I've got Native Americans in World War I, I've got African Americans in World War I, I've got citizenship in World War I and immigrants in World War I. All of it is causing social change. So I am going to provide evidence that supports the thesis, meaning I'm going to identify the changes, but I'm specifically going to be identifying social changes. So I just kind of summarize it for myself. So this is the peak of the Jim Crow era, segregation, and a lot of African Americans chose to show patriotism, fight in the war to prove their value, though they never should have had to. And in many cases, were treated as equals by European troops. And so they tasted what it could be like and expected that they would be treated as war heroes when they returned. But when they came back and it was the same old Jim Crow, they began to push for change. It's kind of the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. So once you have all of your evidence put together for each of your individual changes, what you're going to do is you're going to take the information you have and you're going to turn it into an evidence analysis statement. So my example was the end of the war sparked a new fire to the movement for equality amongst African Americans. Black people in America suffered through severe discrimination during the Jim Crow era before World War I and beyond. However, their experiences on the battlefield, treated as equal by European troops, gave more power to their fight against inequality following the end of World War I. So now I've got my statement written. All I do is I take it and I plop it into my essay where I think that it fits the best. Okay, so you've already got it written. So now, by the time you're done with brainstorming, you've got your thesis written, you've identified a theme, you have all of your evidence and analysis done. So that just leaves your conclusion. You're done. You're just putting it together. So now we're going to move on to that piece for conclusion. So conclusion is really where you're showing to me that you have synthesized the information. You've been able to narrow a lot of information down to 5 important discussion points, but now you need to narrow it down to that theme that you already identified. So what you're going to do is you're going to restate the question in kind of a non-repetitive, simple way. So American history changed as a result of World War I, and now you tie in your theme. So it changed as a result of World War I, causing enormous amounts of social change throughout different minority communities. You're tying it in. Okay, once you've tied it in, now you're looking at implications. So if we have a bunch of social change amongst minority communities, what can we anticipate is potentially going to happen as a result in the 1920s following World War I? So your conclusion is going to tie it all together, wrap it up in a nice little bow, and you're done. If you still have questions or you're confused about what you need to do, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to clarify anything that you need. But hopefully this helps. I hope you have a great rest of your night.